December 23rd, 1945. Somewhere in the American occupation zone, Western Germany. The frost bit through Sergeant James Davis's wool uniform as he stood outside the requisitions depot, his breath crystallizing in the twilight air. Inside his pocket, his fingers traced the edges of a worn photograph. His own daughter, Sally, back in Ohio, her gap-toothed smile frozen in happier times. He had not seen her in 2 years. Before him, stacked against the depot's corrugated wall, lay rows upon rows of firewood, each log stamped with the olive-drab markings of U.S. Army property. Davis knew what he was about to do. Violated General Eisenhower's non-fraternization policy. He knew that borrowing military resources for the enemy population could cost him his stripes, perhaps even a court-martial. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see were the faces of German children he'd passed that morning. Faces far too hollow, too ancient, too resigned for their tender years. Those faces haunted him more than any memory of combat. The weight of winter and policy. The winter of 1945 descended upon Germany, not merely as a season but as a reckoning. Cities that had once hummed with industrial might now lay in geometric patterns of destruction. Walls without roofs, windows without glass, streets buried beneath mountains of rubble that would take a generation to clear. In Hamburg, 700,000 people lived in cellars and ruins. In Berlin, women formed human chains to pass bricks, clearing pathways through their own devastated city, one stone at a time. In Cologne, the great cathedral stood skeletal against the sky, surrounded by a moonscape of annihilation that stretched in every direction. For the American soldiers who now patrolled these ghost towns, the official policy was clear and uncompromising. No fraternization with German civilians. The directive, issued by Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, prohibited American personnel from mingling with Germans on terms of friendliness, from visiting German homes, from playing games or sports with them, from shaking their hands or engaging in conversations beyond official business. The policy had been somewhat softened in October of 1945, allowing American soldiers to speak with German children and play with them in the street. But the underlying message remained rigid. These people were the enemy, and sympathy was a luxury the victors could not afford. The reasoning behind this policy was not without merit. Germany had unleashed 6 years of mechanized horror upon the world. 60 million people had perished in the furnace of total war. The death camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen, had revealed depths of human depravity that defied comprehension. American soldiers who had liberated these camps emerged changed, their faces hardened into masks of controlled fury. How could one shake hands with a nation that had systematized murder on an industrial scale? And yet policy existed in the realm of paper and principle, while soldiers lived in the realm of mud and moral ambiguity. They walked through streets where children begged for chocolate in broken English. They saw women digging through garbage for potato peelings. They heard the coughing that echoed from unheated buildings as pneumonia and tuberculosis spread through the population, like wildfire through dry kindling. The average German civilian was allocated just 1,550 calories per day, enough to prevent immediate starvation, insufficient for genuine survival, especially in the killing cold of a German winter. Sergeant James Davis was not a complicated man. Before the war, he had worked at a hardware store in Canton, Ohio, selling nails and hammer handles, helping farmers fix their plows, teaching Boy Scouts how to build fires on weekend camping trips. He had enlisted in 1942, 2 days after his 30th birthday, driven by a sense of duty that needed no complex articulation. His country had been attacked, and decent men did not sit idle while the world burned. He had fought through France, survived the Bulge, crossed the Rhine. He had seen things that would wake him gasping in the night for decades to come. But war had not succeeded in burning away his fundamental decency, had not managed to extinguish that small, stubborn flame of human compassion that persisted despite everything. The faces that wouldn't fade it had started 3 days earlier, on the 20th of December. Davis and his squad had been conducting a routine patrol through what remained of a residential district when they passed a building that had once been a primary school. The structure still stood, more or less intact, a minor miracle in a neighborhood where most buildings existed only as suggestions of their former selves. Outside the school, 30 or 40 children stood in a ragged line, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. They ranged in age from perhaps 5 to 12 years old, all wearing clothes that hung loose on bodies that had learned hunger as a constant companion. Many wore shoes that had been repaired so many times they were more string and cardboard than leather. The children were not playing. They were not talking. They simply stood, waiting with the patience of those who had learned that hurrying changed nothing. Their eyes followed the American patrol with expressions that contained neither hope nor fear, merely a kind of flat acknowledgement, the look of animals who had grown accustomed to observing predators from a careful distance. Private Tommy Richardson, a kid from Arkansas who still got teary-eyed when mail call brought letters from his mother, had stopped walking. "Sarge," he'd said quietly, "what are they doing?" Davis had asked the same question of a German man hurrying past, an older civilian with a face like crumpled newspaper. The man had paused, considered whether answering would cause him trouble, then shrugged. What could they do to him that life hadn't already accomplished? Waiting for soup, he'd explained in careful textbook English. The school makes soup once per day. Sometimes there is enough for everyone, sometimes not. Then he'd added, almost as an afterthought, the building has no heat. The windows were blown out in March. They have covered them with paper and cloth, but another shrug, this one containing volumes of resignation. That night, Davis had not been able to sleep. He kept seeing those children, their stillness, their terrible patience. He thought about Sally back home, how she complained when dinner was 10 minutes late, how she'd cried when they'd run out of sugar for her birthday cake. These German children, enemy children, technically, waited in sub-freezing temperatures for watered-down soup that might not come. They attended school in buildings where frost formed on the interior walls. They slept in dormitories where their breath froze, where chilblains and pneumonia were not possibilities, but certainties. Davis was not naive. He knew that somewhere some of these children had fathers who had worn SS uniforms, mothers who had enthusiastically attended Nazi rallies, grandparents who had looked the other way while their Jewish neighbors disappeared. Germany's collective guilt was not a fiction. It was a reality written in the ashes of millions. But guilt, Davis had come to understand, was a complex thing. It could be collective and individual simultaneously. It could exist as historical fact while still leaving room for mercy toward the innocent caught in its machinery. These children had not chosen the war. They had not voted for Hitler or built the camps or pulled the triggers. They had merely been born in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now they were being sentenced to freeze for sins they were too young to have committed. The conspiracy of conscience. On the evening of December 21st, Davis had called together 4 men he trusted. Richardson, the Arkansas farm boy with the soft heart. Corporal Michael Santos, a carpenter's son from Massachusetts, who could fix anything with enough wire and stubbornness. Private First Class Henry Goldman, a New York Jew, whose entire extended family in Poland had vanished into the darkness. And Private Eugene Red McCarthy, an Irish kid from Boston who approached every regulation with the same question. Yeah, but what if we just didn't? They met in the back of the motor pool, ostensibly checking oil levels in the trucks. Davis had laid out his idea without preamble. They would borrow one of the 2.5-ton trucks, load it with firewood from the depot, and deliver it to the school and the orphanage down the street. It would take perhaps 2 hours, counting load time and transport. They would do it at dusk, when visibility was low and most officers were at dinner. If caught, Davis would take full responsibility. The others were just following orders. He'd expected objections, at least token resistance. Instead, he'd gotten silence, then nods. Goldman had spoken first, his voice careful, measuring each word. "My mother," he'd said, "she used to tell me this story from the Talmud, about how saving one life is like saving the entire world. I used to think that was just pretty poetry." He'd paused, staring at his hands. "These kids, they didn't do anything. Their parents, maybe, but..." He'd trailed off, then looked up at Davis. "When do we go?" Red McCarthy had laughed, a short bark of sound. "My old man always said, the best way to fight the devil is to do the exact thing he doesn't expect. Figure the devil would expect us to follow orders and let those kids freeze. So yeah, Sarge, count me in." Richardson had simply said, "Those kids look like my little cousins back home. Can't just let 'em freeze." Santos had been the most pragmatic. How much firewood can we fit in one truck? How many buildings need heat? We better make a list, do this right if we're gonna do it at all. And so the conspiracy had taken shape, not through grand speeches or philosophical debates, but through the quiet arithmetic of decent men deciding that some orders, no matter how official, demanded to be disobeyed. The captain who didn't see. They had one more obstacle: Captain William Harrison, their company commander. Harrison was a West Point man, a career officer who understood that military discipline was not a suggestion, but the essential architecture holding an army together. He was also, Davis suspected, a man whose conscience occasionally waged war with his regulations. On the afternoon of December 22nd, Davis had found Harrison in the company headquarters, a commandeered German administrative building that still smelled faintly of coal smoke and bureaucracy. Davis had knocked, been admitted, stood at attention while Harrison finished reviewing supply requisitions. "At ease, Sergeant. What can I do for you?" Davis had rehearsed several approaches, various circumlocutions and careful phrasings. Instead, he'd found himself speaking plainly. "Sir, there's a school and an orphanage about 3 kilometers from here. Maybe 60, 70 kids total. No heat. I saw them 2 days ago. Some of them got frostbite starting on their hands and feet." He'd paused. "We got firewood sitting at the depot. More than we need. I'd like permission to deliver some to those buildings." Harrison had looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You're asking me to authorize the diversion of military supplies to enemy civilians in direct contravention of non-fraternization policy." "Yes, sir. These buildings, they're not military targets. No concerns about security. Just a school and an orphanage, sir. I did reconnaissance. No military presence, no weapons, no threat." Harrison had stood, walked to the window, looked out at the gray afternoon. When he'd spoken, his voice had been quiet. "I have a daughter, 8 years old, named Emily. She's in Virginia right now with my wife, probably decorating a Christmas tree, probably complaining about having to wear her winter coat to school." He'd turned back to Davis. "I think about what I'd want someone to do if our situations were reversed. If Emily was in one of those buildings." "Yes, sir. Sergeant Davis, I'm about to go to dinner at Battalion HQ. I will be gone for approximately 3 hours. During that time, I expect all personnel to exercise good judgment and to remember that they are representatives of the United States Army and the values this nation holds dear." He'd looked directly at Davis. "I also expect that if any unusual activities were to occur during my absence, they would be conducted with absolute discretion and in such a manner that no official report would be necessary. Do you understand me, Sergeant?" "Perfectly, sir." "Then you're dismissed." "And, Sergeant, if anyone asks, this conversation never happened." "What conversation, sir?" Harrison had almost smiled. Exactly. The Liberation of Firewood. At 17:30 hours on December 23rd, dusk settling over the broken landscape like gray gauze, Davis and his 4 conspirators pulled a GMC 2.5-ton truck up to the firewood depot. The depot's guard, a young private named Jenkins from somewhere in Kansas, had looked at the requisition form Davis presented, a form Santos had prepared that afternoon with impressive attention to bureaucratic detail. "This says it's for Battalion HQ," Jenkins had observed. "That's right," Davis had confirmed. "They're having some bigwig visitors from Corps. Want to make sure the building's warm for their precious asses." Jenkins had considered this, decided that officers wanting comfort was the most believable thing he'd heard all day, and waved them through. For the next 40 minutes, the 5 soldiers worked with the coordinated efficiency of men who'd spent years loading and unloading equipment under pressure. The truck's bed filled with split oak and pine, enough wood to keep 2 buildings warm for at least a week, perhaps longer if carefully rationed. They loaded 387 logs. Santos counted, because Santos counted everything. As they worked, snow began to fall. Not the picturesque, gentle snow of Christmas cards, but the harsh, wind-driven snow of a German winter, the kind that promised misery to anyone without shelter and heat. Richardson, stacking logs in the truck bed, had said, "Maybe this is wrong. Maybe we shouldn't interfere. Maybe it's not our place." Goldman, working beside him, had responded without pausing in his work. "My uncle, before the war, he had this saying, 'The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing.' Some British guy said it, I think. Point is, sometimes doing nothing is the worst thing you can do." He'd hefted another log into place. "We can do something, so we do it." That's the whole philosophy. At 18:20 hours, they drove through the shattered streets toward the school. The city lay quiet under its blanket of new snow, smoke rising from a few buildings that had managed to secure fuel. Most structures dark and cold as tombs. They passed other patrols, American soldiers hunched against the cold, German civilians hurrying nowhere, everyone trying to survive one more day in a world that had forgotten mercy. The moment everything changed, the school loomed ahead, a 3-story brick structure that had survived the war largely intact except for missing windows on the upper floors. Dim light glowed from the ground floor. Candles or oil lamps, Davis guessed, the feeble defiance of light against the encroaching darkness and cold. The truck pulled to a stop in front of the main entrance. Davis cut the engine. In the sudden silence, they could hear children's voices from inside, not playing or laughing, but the hushed sounds of youngsters trying to stay quiet, conserve energy, make themselves small. "All right," Davis said. "Let's get this done quick and clean. Stack the wood by the entrance where they can access it easily. No talking unless necessary. Red, you and Santos handle the orphanage after we finish here. Richardson, Goldman, you're with me." They climbed out of the truck, and the school's front door opened. A woman emerged, and Davis watched her transformation in real time. Watched her face progress through confusion, to fear, to something approaching terror. She was perhaps 55 or 60 years old, thin in the way that spoke of prolonged hunger rather than natural build, wearing a heavy coat that had been mended repeatedly. Her gray hair was pulled back severely, and her hands, clasped in front of her, trembled slightly. She stood frozen on the top step, and Davis suddenly understood what she was seeing. American soldiers appearing without warning at dusk, their truck blocking the entrance. In her experience, nothing good came from such visits. Inspections meant confiscations. Military presence meant trouble. The war might have ended, but its logic persisted. Authority meant danger. Davis removed his helmet, held it awkwardly in his hands, tried to make himself look less like a conqueror. "Ma'am, he said in his careful high school German. "We brought firewood. For the children. To stay warm." She stared at him without comprehension, her mouth opening slightly. Behind her, other faces appeared in the doorway. Children, mostly, and two other adults, all wearing the same expression of confusion, mixed with apprehension. When she didn't respond, Davis tried again, gesturing to the truck. "Holz, Brennholz, für die Kinder, wood, firewood, for the children." Still she stood, unmoving, and Davis realized that she was not confused about his words. She was confused about his intent. The concept of American soldiers bringing them fuel, bringing them anything without demanding something in return, fell so far outside her framework of experience that she could not process it. For 12 years, she had lived in a nation where everything operated according to rigid hierarchies of power, where mercy was weakness, where help came only with strings attached. And now, here was this American soldier, speaking terrible German, claiming to have brought firewood as if such a thing were natural and normal. Davis made a decision. Without waiting for permission, he walked to the back of the truck, lowered the tailgate, and lifted out a log. He carried it to the entrance and set it down carefully on the step beside the woman. Then he went back for another, and another. Richardson and Goldman joined him. The three men worked in silence, creating a growing pile of split wood beside the school's entrance. With each log they set down, the woman's expression changed incrementally, fear giving way to uncertainty, uncertainty giving way to cautious wonder. Finally, after they'd unloaded perhaps 30 logs, she spoke. Her voice was rough, unused to expression. "Warum? Why?" Davis straightened, looked at her directly. He thought about all the speeches he'd heard, all the talks about democracy and freedom and defeating tyranny. He thought about the official reasons, the policy justifications, the grand historical narratives. Then, he thought about Sally back home, about the German children waiting in the cold, about the fundamental, undeniable fact that some things transcended policy and history and nationality. "Weil sie Kinder sind," he said simply. "Because they are children." The breaking of ice. For perhaps 10 seconds nothing moved. The snow fell. The soldiers stood. The woman stared. Then something shifted in her face. A wall crumbling, a dam breaking. Her eyes filled with tears, and she pressed one hand to her mouth, as if to hold back a sound that needed to emerge. "Danke," she whispered. "Thank you." Then louder, "Danke, danke." Behind her, the children began to emerge. First hesitantly, then in a rush. They poured out of the building like water from a broken pipe, 24 small bundled figures who'd been watching from the windows. They surrounded the truck, their eyes huge, their breath creating a fog of collective amazement. The woman. Later, Davis would learn her name was Frau Margareta Schmidt, and that she'd been a teacher at this school since 1933, and that she'd lost her only son at Stalingrad, descended the steps and approached Davis. She was shorter than he'd realized, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. When she looked up at him, her face was wet with tears and snow and something that might have been relief or gratitude or simply the physical manifestation of emotional overload. 15 years, she said in English that was heavily accented but clear. I have been a teacher. 15 years I teach the children to expect nothing, to trust no kindness, to understand that the strong take and the weak give. 15 years I tell them the world is hard and cruel, and they must be harder and crueler to survive. She gestured at the pile of wood, at the soldiers continuing to unload. You are teaching me I was wrong. You are teaching me I must unlearn 15 years. Richardson, passing with another load, paused. Ma'am, we're just bringing some firewood. Ain't teaching nothing. But Frau Schmidt shook her head emphatically. No! You teach everything. You teach that enemy can be human, that victor can be merciful, that rules can be wrong and kindness can be right. She looked back at the children, who had begun, tentatively, to touch the wood, running their small hands over the rough bark as if it were precious silk. You teach them that the world is different than they thought. That is everything. The unloading continued. Santos and McCarthy drove to the orphanage 3 blocks away, where they would encounter a similar scene. A director who initially believed they'd come to requisition the building itself. Children who'd learned not to hope. The slow dawning of understanding that this was not a trick or a trap, but simply an act of unexpected kindness. As the work neared completion, Davis reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his carefully hoarded stash. 4 Hershey's chocolate bars he'd been saving for Christmas, along with a half-dozen hard candies Richardson had contributed. He broke the chocolate into pieces and distributed it among the children. Their faces as they tasted the sweetness, perhaps the first sugar many had experienced in months, would stay with him longer than any battlefield memory. The understanding they shared. When the truck was empty, Davis and his men prepared to leave. The children had been ushered back inside. Frau Schmidt was fiercely protective, unwilling to let them stay in the cold, despite their protests. But she remained, standing beside the now enormous pile of firewood that represented warmth and survival and proof that the universe could occasionally surprise you. "I cannot repay this," she said to Davis. "I have nothing to give. Don't need repayment, ma'am. It's Christmas. Kids should be warm at Christmas." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that passed between 2 people who'd both seen the worst of human nature and chosen not to become it. When the war ended, she said, "I thought, now we pay. Now comes the revenge. The Russians in the East, they—" She paused, and Davis saw the shadow cross her face, the knowledge of horrors that confirmed her expectations. "I thought, the Americans will be the same. Why would they not be? We burned their cities with fire from the sky. We killed their sons. Why would they be kind?" "We're not all kind," Davis said, honestly. "Some guys, they're still real angry, and they got a right to be. But being angry and being cruel, those are different things. Most guys, they can tell the difference between fighting soldiers and hurting children. Can they? I am not sure we could," she said it matter-of-factly. A statement of historical observation, rather than confession. "We were told that mercy was weakness, that kindness was sentimentality, that real strength required hardness." She gestured at the firewood again. "You are strong. You won the war, but you bring wood to enemy children. This I do not understand according to what I was taught." Davis thought about this. He was not an educated man, not someone comfortable with philosophy or abstract reasoning. But he understood things on a gut level. The way you understand the feel of good wood grain or the balance of a properly hung door. "Maybe," he said slowly. "Real strength is when you can afford to be kind, when you don't have to be cruel because you're not afraid anymore. We won. We're not scared of you, so we can afford to remember your people." Frau Schmidt considered this, then nodded slowly. Perhaps this is true." She extended her hand, a gesture that violated regulations that technically Davis should have refused. Instead, he took it, felt her thin, cold fingers grip his with surprising strength. "Frohe Weihnachten," she said. "Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, ma'am." The silent blessing. They drove back to base through streets now fully dark, the truck's headlights cutting tunnels through the falling snow. No one spoke. Richardson hummed something that might have been a carol. Goldman stared out the window at the ruined cityscape. Santos checked and rechecked the truck's fuel gauge, always practical. McCarthy grinned his Irish grin, satisfied with a night's work well done. When they returned the truck to the motor pool, Jenkins, the depot guard, was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps genuinely absent, perhaps exercising the kind of selective blindness that makes certain types of disobedience possible. They parked, locked up, dispersed to their quarters, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The next morning, Christmas Eve, Davis was summoned to Captain Harrison's office. He went expecting consequences, prepared for whatever punishment military justice deemed appropriate. Instead, he found Harrison behind his desk, examining a report with exaggerated concentration. "Sergeant Davis," Harrison said without looking up, "I've been reviewing supply logs. Seems we're exactly where we should be on firewood consumption. No discrepancies, no irregularities. Everything perfectly normal." "Yes, sir." "That's good to hear, sir." "Indeed. I'd hate to have to explain any missing supplies to battalion." Harrison looked up then, met Davis's eyes. "I trust nothing extraordinary happened during my absence yesterday evening?" "Nothing extraordinary, sir. Quiet night, routine patrol. Excellent. Dismissed." Davis was at the door when Harrison spoke again. "Sergeant, for what it's worth, I received a message this morning through civilian channels. A German woman, a school teacher, wanting to express gratitude to the American Army for their professionalism and humanity." He paused. "She specifically mentioned that her students would remember the kindness of American soldiers for the rest of their lives. Thought you might want to know that." "Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Sergeant. I wasn't there, remember. I have no idea what she's talking about." But Harrison's slight smile said everything necessary. The ripples in time. That Christmas night, 1945, warm light glowed from the windows of a German school and orphanage for the first time in 8 months. Children slept beneath blankets in rooms heated by American firewood delivered by American soldiers in defiance of American orders. Frau Schmidt sat by a stove, watching the flames, thinking about what she would tell her students when they asked about the men who'd brought the wood. How do you explain mercy to children who've been taught that mercy doesn't exist? How do you describe kindness from enemies to children who've been told that enemies can only hate? She decided she would tell them the truth, that human beings are complicated and contradictory, capable of both extraordinary cruelty and unexpected grace. That winning a war doesn't require losing your humanity. That rules are sometimes meant to be broken, especially when breaking them serves a higher law, the law written not in regulations or policies, but in the simple recognition that children should not freeze, regardless of what nation they happen to have been born in. In the years that followed, Germany would undergo the most remarkable transformation in modern history. From pariah nation to prosperous democracy, from enemy to ally, from symbol of totalitarian darkness to beacon of European unity. This transformation had many architects. The Marshall Plan with its $20 billion in reconstruction aid, wise statesmen who chose integration over punishment, the German people themselves who confronted their past with painful honesty. But underneath the official histories and the grand narratives, there were millions of small moments, like the one in December 1945. Moments when individuals chose mercy over vengeance, when soldiers remembered their humanity, despite every reason to forget it. 50 years later, in 1995, an American veteran named James Davis received a letter from Germany. It came from a woman named Anna Becker, a professor of English literature at the University of Heidelberg. She wrote that she had been 7 years old in the winter of 1945, a student at a school in the American occupation zone. She remembered the evening American soldiers had brought firewood, remembered tasting chocolate for the first time in her life, remembered her teacher crying tears of relief and confusion. "I am writing," Professor Becker explained, "because I have spent my career studying American literature and culture, trying to understand the country whose soldiers showed me kindness when I had no right to expect it. I have 3 children and 7 grandchildren now. On Christmas Eve each year, we light our fireplace, and I tell them the story of the American soldiers who broke their own army's rules to keep German children warm. I tell them this story because I want them to understand that even in the darkest times, even between enemies, human decency can survive if individuals are willing to risk something to preserve it. She concluded, "You may not remember me. You may not even remember that night, as I'm sure you performed many acts of kindness during your service. But I remember, and I wanted you to know that the wood you brought kept more than our bodies warm. It kept alive our faith that human beings could be something better than our worst moments, something more than the sum of our collective sins. Thank you for teaching a 7-year-old girl that mercy exists even in wartime. It is a lesson I have never forgotten." Davis, reading this letter in his living room in Ohio, 80 years old and fighting back tears, thought about that December night. He thought about the cold and the fear and the simple decision that some orders demanded disobedience. He thought about Frau Schmidt's trembling hands and the children's huge eyes and the way Richardson had hummed carols on the drive back to base. He had never considered himself a hero. Heroes charged machine gun nests and saved lives under fire. He had simply delivered firewood to freezing children because watching them freeze had been intolerable. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the most important acts of courage and decency were precisely those that seemed ordinary, those that required no medals or monuments, those that simply insisted on treating human beings as human beings regardless of what regulations or histories or hatreds might decree otherwise. The choice we make. Every day, the story of American soldiers defying orders to help German children is not unique to December 1945. Similar acts occurred throughout the occupation. Soldiers sharing rations with hungry civilians, medics treating German patients, officers looking the other way as their men exercised unauthorized compassion. These acts violated policy, but honored a deeper principle, the recognition that the line between victor and vanquished, friend and enemy, us and them, is always more fluid and permeable than official documents acknowledge. War brings out the worst in humanity, the capacity for cruelty, for dehumanization, for treating fellow human beings as obstacles to be eliminated or resources to be exploited. But it also, paradoxically, reveals the best, the stubborn persistence of conscience, the refusal to surrender to hatred, the small daily choices through which ordinary people insist on remaining human, even when everything around them argues for becoming monsters. Sergeant James Davis and his 4 conspirators made such a choice. They risked punishment to deliver firewood to children whose nation had murdered millions. They violated regulations to preserve their own humanity. They broke rules to follow a law older than armies or nations, the law that says children should not freeze, that mercy is never weakness, that kindness to the vulnerable is never wasted, regardless of who the vulnerable might be. The frost still bit that December night. The ruins remained ruins. Germany's guilt was neither erased nor excused by an act of unauthorized charity. But in one school and one orphanage, warmth replaced cold, hope challenged despair, and possibility glimmered where only darkness had been. It was not much, measured against the scale of destruction and suffering that surrounded it. But it was not nothing. It was never nothing, because every act of defiant kindness plants seeds. Some grow immediately, some take decades, some remain dormant for generations, before suddenly blooming into forests we cannot predict or measure. The warmth Sergeant Davis delivered on December 23, 1945, kept children alive through one winter. But the memory of that warmth, the lesson it taught about what human beings can choose to be, even in the aftermath of horror, that warmth has been passed down now through 3 generations, spreading outward in ways neither Davis nor Frau Schmidt nor those freezing children could have imagined. This is how the world changes. not through grand declarations or official policies alone, but through individuals who decide that some orders are worth disobeying, that some rules are meant to be broken, that there are laws written in conscience that supersede laws written on paper. Through soldiers who remember they are human beings first and warriors second. Through teachers who tell students that mercy exists even between enemies. Through children who grow up remembering that an enemy soldier once brought them firewood and chocolate and refused to let them freeze. The frost still bites, the darkness still falls, but somewhere, always, someone chooses warmth over cold, kindness over cruelty, humanity over hatred, and that choice, repeated millions of times in millions of small moments that history rarely records, is how we survive our worst selves and become something better. That December night in 1945, 5 American soldiers stole Army firewood to heat enemy buildings. It was insubordination. It was unauthorized. It was technically illegal. It was absolutely right. And somewhere in Germany today, a great-grandmother named Anna Becker tells her great-grandchildren about the Americans who taught her that mercy could survive even war. And those children will carry that story forward into futures we cannot see, keeping that small flame alive one generation at a time, proving that sometimes the most important act of defiance is simply refusing to let the world's cruelty make you cruel in return.